we received a phone call at our home one evening from a good friend of Elvis's, a gentleman named George Klein. And my mother answered the phone, came in the room.
What hidden emotions might Elvis Presley have been concealing during his final phone call? And how does this brief conversation reflect the deeper struggles he faced in his last days? Elvis Presley's last phone call holds an undeniable weight in the narrative of his final hours. It was the last documented conversation he had before his tragic death, and it offers a brief but poignant glimpse into his emotional state. The content of their conversation, though private, has since been discussed in interviews and memoirs, with Alden sharing how Elvis seemed distant, yet thoughtful. While Elvis's words were simple, they carried a heaviness that seemed to foreshadow the tragedy that would unfold just hours later. He reportedly told Ginger, "I'm going to the bathroom to read." It was a routine comment, reflecting his desire for privacy. Yet in hindsight, this seemingly innocuous remark has taken on a tragic significance. Ginger recalled that Elvis did not appear distressed during the call, but she sensed a kind of exhaustion in his voice, a weariness that mirrored the struggles he had been dealing with in his personal and professional life. The call itself was brief, with no dramatic farewells or lengthy conversations. It was, by all accounts, just an ordinary exchange between two people who were in the midst of planning a future together. However, it is precisely this ordinariness that makes the final words of Elvis Presley so heartbreaking. There was no grand goodbye, no last-minute confession, just a man quietly going about his evening. For many fans, this final conversation is a reminder of the vulnerability and humanity behind the larger-than-life persona of Elvis Presley. Ginger Alden, Elvis Presley's fiancée at the time of his death, was the recipient of his last phone call. Their relationship had been one of ups and downs, marked by both affection and challenges. But in those final moments, Ginger was the one Elvis chose to reach out to. The choice of making his last phone call to her speaks volumes about the significance of their bond. While their relationship was often scrutinized in the public eye, this final gesture highlights that, in his last hours, Elvis still found comfort in her presence. For Ginger, receiving that phone call was a moment she has carried with her for the rest of her life. In interviews, she has expressed the surreal nature of realizing that she was the last person to speak to Elvis before his untimely passing. The responsibility of being on the other end of that call, not knowing it would be his last, has added a unique emotional weight to her memories of their relationship. While the conversation itself was brief, it has been a defining moment in her personal history. The significance of this call also lies in the fact that Elvis chose to speak with Ginger, rather than someone from his inner circle, such as his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, or his lifelong friends. This choice suggests that despite the challenges in his personal life, Elvis still sought comfort in his intimate relationships rather than in the professional pressures that had often consumed him. Ginger's reflection on this call provides a deeply personal perspective on Elvis's final hours, shedding light on the private world of a man who was, to many, an untouchable icon. Elvis Presley's final phone call was brief, but the emotional weight behind it has resonated deeply with those who have studied his life and death. While the content of the call may seem mundane on the surface, the emotional context reveals a man grappling with overwhelming pressures, both personal and professional. Elvis, in his last moments, was a man who had reached a point of exhaustion, physically and mentally. The phone call he made to Ginger Alden can be viewed as a quiet cry for normalcy amidst the chaos of his life. The tone of the conversation, as recalled by Ginger, was calm but distant. Elvis didn't sound overly emotional, yet there was an undercurrent of weariness in his voice. This weariness likely stemmed from his ongoing struggles with health issues, his grueling performance schedule, and the emotional toll of being in the public eye for so many years. His decision to make the call late at night, just before retreating to the bathroom, can be seen as symbolic of the solitude he often sought in those final years. The emotional weight of this conversation lies in what it represents: a fleeting moment of human connection before an untimely end. For many, it is a sobering reminder that even someone as iconic as Elvis Presley was, at his core, a man struggling with his own demons. The brevity of the call only adds to the heartbreak, as it leaves fans and loved ones wondering if there was something more Elvis wished to say but couldn't find the words for. In those final moments, the emotional burden he carried was perhaps too heavy to fully express. One of the most haunting aspects of Elvis Presley's last phone call is the possibility that he may have been trying to communicate something deeper. While his final words to Ginger Alden were simple and routine, some have speculated that there may have been an unspoken message behind them. Elvis had been battling numerous health issues, including heart problems and drug dependency, and it is possible that, in those final moments, he was grappling with the enormity of his situation. Although he didn't explicitly ask for help during the call, some have wondered if Elvis's decision to reach out to Ginger was, in itself, a plea for connection. He may not have voiced his distress, but the very act of making a phone call suggests that he didn't want to be completely alone. Some biographers have pointed out that Elvis had a tendency to withdraw into himself when he was feeling overwhelmed, and this final call could be seen as an attempt to reach out, even if he didn't fully articulate his feelings. The idea of an unanswered plea is both tragic and thought-provoking. It raises questions about whether Elvis felt he had the support he needed in those final hours, or if he was too proud or too weary to ask for it directly. This unanswered question continues to fuel speculation about what Elvis may have been going through emotionally and mentally during his last phone call. While we may never know for sure, the possibility that he was trying to send a message adds an additional layer of heartbreak to his final moments. The moments leading up to the end of Elvis Presley's last phone call are shrouded in a sense of mystery and quiet finality. The phone call to Ginger Alden was brief, seemingly routine, yet it was the last interaction Elvis would have with anyone before his tragic passing. While the words exchanged were simple, Elvis mentioned he was going to the bathroom to read. There is a haunting sense of inevitability in how the conversation came to an end. The call occurred late at night, around the early morning hours of August 16, 1977. Elvis had spent much of the previous evening quietly at Graceland, preparing for a trip to Portland, Maine, for another scheduled performance. However, in those final hours, Elvis's health was deteriorating, something that had been apparent to those around him for years. His struggles with prescription drugs, heart issues, and fatigue had left him visibly weakened. Yet, in his phone call to Ginger, there was no sign of alarm, no desperate words, just a man who seemed ready to wind down his evening. The brevity of the conversation has left many speculating about what Elvis might have been thinking in those final minutes before hanging up. Was there more he wanted to say but couldn't bring himself to voice? Did he feel any premonition about the fate that awaited him? Or was he simply exhausted from years of relentless public scrutiny and physical decline? What is clear is that Elvis ended the call calmly, perhaps unaware that this would be his last spoken interaction with the world. The abrupt end to the conversation is significant because it reflects Elvis's tendency to keep his deeper emotions hidden from even those closest to him. He had always been a private man, someone who carried the weight of fame and personal struggle in silence. As the call ended, it's possible that Ginger sensed nothing out of the ordinary, assuming Elvis would return to bed shortly. Yet, as she would soon discover, that phone call marked the final moments of Elvis Presley's life. In retrospect, the end of that conversation carries a heavy emotional weight. It was the last moment of connection Elvis had with another human being before he passed away, alone in his bathroom. For many fans, the fact that this phone call ended without any grand farewell or emotional outburst makes it all the more tragic. Elvis, the man who had been adored by millions, spent his final moments in quiet solitude, his last conversation ending just as uneventfully as it had begun. Elvis Presley's state of mind during his final days has been the subject of much speculation, and his last phone call offers a rare glimpse into what he may have been feeling. While the content of the call was brief and seemingly ordinary, the context surrounding it reveals a man who had been grappling with immense physical and emotional burdens. To understand the significance of this last conversation, it's essential to look at the pressures Elvis had been facing leading up to his death. By the time of his final phone call, Elvis had been battling numerous health issues, many of which were exacerbated by his grueling performance schedule and dependency on prescription drugs. His body was deteriorating, and those around him had noticed a marked change in his energy and demeanor. Despite this, Elvis continued to push himself to perform, driven by a combination of obligation and a desire to reconnect with his fans. However, the toll it was taking on him was undeniable. In the phone call with Ginger Alden, there were no outward signs of distress or emotional turmoil. Elvis sounded calm, even resigned, as he mentioned his plans to read in the bathroom. Yet, beneath this calm exterior, it's possible that Elvis was feeling the weight of his struggles more deeply than he let on. His decision to call Ginger in the first place suggests that, on some level, he sought human connection during what would be his final hours. Whether consciously or subconsciously, Elvis may have been trying to hold on to a sense of normalcy in an increasingly chaotic life. Psychologists who have studied the final moments of individuals facing extreme stress or illness often note that people can enter a state of emotional detachment. This detachment allows them to carry out routine tasks without fully processing the gravity of their situation. In Elvis' case, his decision to make the phone call, speak calmly, and mention reading may have been part of this detachment, a way to distance himself from the physical and emotional pain he was experiencing. Another factor that likely influenced Elvis's state of mind was his long-standing battle with loneliness. Despite being surrounded by an entourage and adored by millions of fans, Elvis often felt isolated. His fame had created a barrier between him and the world, leaving him to deal with his personal struggles in private. This sense of isolation may have contributed to the tone of his last conversation, a brief, seemingly mundane exchange that hinted at a deeper loneliness beneath the surface. In the end, Elvis' last phone call reflects a man who, despite his public persona, was battling internal demons. His calm demeanor during the call may have masked a deeper emotional turmoil, one that he had learned to hide after years in the spotlight. For fans and biographers, this final conversation offers a haunting glimpse into the fragile state of mind of a man who had given so much to the world but struggled to find peace within himself. For Ginger Alden, the recipient of Elvis Presley's last phone call, the shock of realizing she was the last person to speak with him before his death has remained a defining moment in her life. In the years since Elvis's passing, Ginger has spoken about the emotional weight of that phone call, reflecting on how it has shaped her memories of their time together and her understanding of Elvis's final moments. When Elvis called her late that night, Ginger likely had no inkling that this would be their last conversation. As she later recalled, the call was brief, with Elvis mentioning that he was going to the bathroom to read a common routine for him. There was no sense of alarm or distress in his voice, and Ginger, assuming nothing was amiss, went back to sleep after the call ended. It wasn't until the following morning, when she discovered Elvis unresponsive in the bathroom, that the true gravity of the situation became clear. The shock of that moment has stayed with Ginger throughout her life. In interviews, she has described the surreal experience of realizing that she had been the last person to hear Elvis's voice, and the guilt and grief that came with it. For years, Ginger has faced public scrutiny and speculation about her role in Elvis's final hours, but she has always maintained that the phone call was an ordinary exchange, with no indication that anything was wrong. In the immediate aftermath of Elvis's death, Ginger was thrust into the spotlight in a way she had never anticipated. As the fiancée of one of the most famous men in the world, she suddenly found herself at the center of a media frenzy, with reporters and fans alike seeking answers about what had happened in those final hours. For Ginger, the pressure of dealing with both her personal grief and the public's curiosity was overwhelming. The aftermath of Elvis's death also brought with it a sense of loss that went beyond the man himself. For Ginger, their relationship had been a complicated one, marked by both love and challenges. In the wake of his passing, she was left not only to mourn Elvis, but also to come to terms with the unresolved aspects of their relationship. The final phone call, in particular, has been a source of both comfort and heartache for her comfort in knowing she was there for him in his last moments, but heartache in realizing that their time together had come to such an abrupt and tragic end. Elvis Presley's final phone call was not just a moment of personal reflection. It also symbolized the complexity of his relationships, particularly with Ginger Alden. At the time of his death, Elvis and Ginger had been engaged, though their relationship was often a subject of speculation. The call offers a window into the state of their bond at that point, and it underscores some of the challenges Elvis faced when it came to maintaining personal relationships amid his fame and personal struggles. When Elvis dialed Ginger's number that night, it reflected his desire for closeness and connection, even as he battled internal demons. Throughout his life, Elvis was surrounded by people including his Memphis Mafia, various girlfriends, and fans. But there was always an undercurrent of loneliness. Many biographers have pointed out that despite the constant attention, Elvis found it difficult to maintain deep, emotionally fulfilling relationships. This is partly why his final phone call to Ginger carries such significance. Ginger was much younger than Elvis, and their relationship had its fair share of ups and downs. Some saw her as a stabilizing force in Elvis's chaotic world, while others believed their relationship was fraught with tension. Regardless of outside perceptions, Elvis seemed to find comfort in her presence, enough so that he chose to call her in his final hours. However, the brevity and simplicity of their conversation could also reflect the distance that sometimes existed between them, a distance that may have been exacerbated by Elvis's declining health and emotional struggles. Elvis's complex relationship with Ginger mirrors many of the dynamics he had with other women in his life. From Priscilla Presley, his ex-wife, to various girlfriends over the years, Elvis' relationships were often influenced by his fame and the pressures that came with it. In many ways, his final call to Ginger symbolizes his attempt to find a sense of normalcy and intimacy in a life that was anything but ordinary. It's possible that in his final moments, Elvis was reaching out not just to Ginger, but to the idea of a stable, grounded relationship, something he had long sought but often found elusive. The call also brings into focus the emotional isolation that Elvis experienced toward the end of his life. Despite being surrounded by people, he still felt a deep sense of loneliness, which may have been why he chose to make the call in the first place. His relationship with Ginger, while not perfect, provided him with a sense of companionship that he craved. Yet, the simplicity of their conversation, his mention of reading in the bathroom suggests that even in his final moments, Elvis kept some part of himself closed off, unable or unwilling to fully express what he was feeling. In the end, Elvis's last phone call was a reflection of both the closeness and the distance that characterized his relationships. It was a brief but significant exchange that highlighted the complexities of his emotional world, a world in which he constantly sought connection, but often struggled to find it in a meaningful way. For those who have studied his life, this call serves as a poignant reminder of the man behind the icon, a man who, despite his fame, was still searching for love and understanding. Elvis Presley's final phone call has long been the subject of speculation, particularly when it comes to the idea of what might have been left unsaid. The brevity of the conversation, Elvis mentioned going to the bathroom to read, has led many to wonder if there was something more he wanted to communicate but couldn't bring himself to say. In the years since his death, fans, biographers, and those close to Elvis have pondered whether his final words were a reflection of deeper emotions he was keeping hidden. One theory is that Elvis may have been too physically and emotionally exhausted to express his true feelings. By the time of his death, he had been dealing with a myriad of health issues, including heart problems and dependency on prescription drugs. These struggles had left him in a weakened state, both physically and mentally. It's possible that in his final moments, Elvis didn't have the energy or clarity of mind to articulate what he was truly feeling. Instead, he opted for a simple, routine conversation, a way to maintain a sense of normalcy in the face of overwhelming circumstances. Another possibility is that Elvis intentionally left certain things unsaid. Throughout his life, he had been a private individual, someone who kept his deepest thoughts and emotions closely guarded. Even those who were closest to him often found it difficult to fully understand what was going on inside his head. In this sense, his final phone call to Ginger Alden may have been a continuation of this pattern. Rather than open up about his fears or struggles, Elvis chose to keep the conversation light, not wanting to burden her or anyone else with the weight of his internal battles. There is also the question of whether Elvis sensed that his time was running out. Some have speculated that he may have had an intuitive sense that he was nearing the end, but chose not to voice it. Instead, he continued with his usual routines, perhaps hoping that by doing so, he could stave off the inevitable. His mention of going to the bathroom to read, a common activity for him, could be seen as a way of reassuring both himself and Ginger that everything was fine even if, deep down, he knew otherwise. For many fans, the idea that Elvis' final words were so ordinary is both heartbreaking and haunting. Here was a man who had lived an extraordinary life, someone who had touched the lives of millions with his music and charisma. Yet, in his final moments, there were no grand declarations, no emotional farewells, just a quiet, unremarkable conversation. This has led to endless speculation about what might have been left unsaid. Was there a final message Elvis wanted to convey but couldn't? Or was he simply too tired, too overwhelmed to say anything at all? In the end, we may never know what Elvis truly felt or thought during that last phone call. What we do know is that his final words have taken on a significance far greater than he could have imagined at the time. For those who loved him, both personally and as fans, the speculation around his last conversation serves as a reminder of the man behind the legend. A man who, in his final moments, was just as vulnerable and human as the rest of us. Elvis Presley's last phone call has come to symbolize not just the end of his life, but also the culmination of the struggles he faced in his final years. While the content of the call was brief, its symbolic significance lies in what it represents: the quiet, often hidden pain that Elvis carried with him until the very end. By the time of his last phone call, Elvis had been dealing with a wide range of health issues, many of which were exacerbated by his reliance on prescription drugs. His physical decline had become evident to those around him, and his once vibrant performances were often marred by fatigue and illness. Yet, despite these struggles, Elvis continued to push forward, determined to maintain the image of the king of rock and roll. This determination, however, came at a cost. The pressures of fame, combined with his declining health, had left him emotionally and physically drained. The phone call to Ginger, in which Elvis mentioned going to the bathroom to read, is a reflection of the mundane routines he clung to in an attempt to find some sense of normalcy. But beneath this veneer of routine lay a man who was deeply troubled. The brevity of the conversation and the simplicity of his words can be seen as symbolic of the emotional exhaustion he was experiencing. Elvis, who had once been a larger-than-life figure, was now reduced to the everyday concerns of a man trying to cope with the pressures of life. The symbolism of this final phone call extends beyond Elvis's personal struggles. It has also come to represent the broader themes of fame, isolation, and the toll that both can take on an individual. Elvis, who had spent much of his life in the spotlight, found himself increasingly isolated as his health declined. The adoration of fans and the demands of his career had left little room for him to focus on his own well-being. In this sense, his last phone call is a reminder of the price that fame can exact on even the most beloved of figures. For those who have studied Elvis's life, The symbolism of his final phone call serves as a powerful reminder of the man behind the legend. It was a moment of quiet reflection, a brief exchange that, in its simplicity, spoke volumes about the struggles Elvis had faced in his final years. While the call itself may have seemed unremarkable at the time, it has since taken on a deeper significance, becoming a symbol of the emotional and physical burdens that ultimately led to Elvis Presley's tragic death.